I found 10 locomotives so bad, the engineers who ran them wanted them gone. One burst into flames on the tracks. One was so long it couldn't fit on a single turntable. One slipped so violently at 80 miles an hour that crews thought they were about to crash. Railroads spent a fortune on these machines and scrapped some in under 3 years. And stick around, because number 1 is a stunning masterpiece that everybody secretly despised. Let's count them down. Number 10. The EMD SD50. Let's start with a locomotive that looked completely ordinary, and that's exactly what makes it sting. This wasn't some wild experiment. It was a mainstream freight diesel from the most trusted builder in America, and it still let engineers down. For decades, EMD was the gold standard. Its locomotives, especially the legendary SD42, were famous for just running and running with almost no drama. So when EMD rolled out the SD50 in the early 1980s, railroads expected another sure thing. General Electric was catching up fast, and EMD needed a more powerful machine to stay ahead. The SD50 was the answer, a 6-axle unit rated at 3,500 horsepower, and later 3,600. The trouble was how EMD got that power. Rather than build a bigger engine, they took their proven 645 engine, the one that made a rock-solid 3,000 horsepower in the SD42, and pushed it harder, raising the engine speed to squeeze out the extra output. And that's where it fell apart. The higher stress and higher revolutions were more than the design wanted to give. The result was broken crankshafts, jammed pistons, and repeated engine failures. It was a case of trying to wring more blood out of the same turnip, and the engine wasn't the only weak spot. The electrical system was troublesome too. Talk to the crews who ran them and you'd hear about headlights that quit, cooling systems that overheated, and electrical control problems that could leave you stalled. The net result was a locomotive that spent far too much of its life in the shop instead of on the road. Railroads noticed. CSX, which owned a big fleet, got so frustrated that in 2006 it started deliberately dialing the horsepower back down to 3,000 to make them behave, relegating many to low priority and secondary work. EMD, for its part, scrambled to design a proper replacement, the SD60, to fix everything the SD50 got wrong. More than 400 SD50s were built, so this wasn't a rare misfire. It was a widely owned, everyday locomotive that quietly damaged EMD's spotless reputation. In fact, many railroaders point to the SD50 as the very machine that let General Electric finally pull ahead of EMD for good. Number 9. The GE U50C. By the late 1960s, Union Pacific was obsessed with big power. It ran the longest, fastest freights in the country and wanted monster locomotives to match. General Electric answered with the U50C, and it turned into one of the shortest-lived road units up ever owned. Built between 1969 and 1971, just 40 of these were made, all for Union Pacific, numbered 5,000 to 5,039. Each one carried two 12-cylinder engines producing a combined 5,000 horsepower. To save weight so the whole thing could ride on 6 axles instead of 8, GE's engineers made a fateful decision. They used aluminum wiring in the high-voltage electrical system instead of copper. That decision nearly burned the fleet to the ground. Aluminum wiring overheated and overheated. Electrical fires broke out repeatedly. By 1974, roughly a tenth of the roster was sidelined by fires. In one of the worst incidents, UP Unit 5012 suffered a major high-voltage blaze. Union Pacific actually rewired one locomotive with copper to prove it could be fixed, and looked into having an outside shop, Morrison Knudsen, do the whole fleet. But the cost was ruled prohibitive, and fire wasn't even the only issue. These units rode on second-hand trucks, salvaged from UP's retired gas turbine big blow locomotives, and those trucks weren't up to the weight. The cast frames developed stress cracks, the engines kept losing oil pressure, the cooling water leaked. The dynamic brake grids, which are supposed to help slow the train, were prone to literally melting down. Crews nicknamed GE's units U-boats, and this one earned every bit of the reputation. When a business downturn hit in 1976, the U50Cs were the first to go. They were withdrawn after just 5 to 7 years of service, the shortest working lives of any of Union Pacific's mainline road units. All 40 were scrapped. A few had one last humiliating job, sitting still as stationary generators during a 1978 coal strike. Number 8. The EMD SD90MAC-H. Proof that hated locomotives aren't just a story from the age of steam. This one is from the 1990s. In the mid-1990s, the two big American builders, EMD and General Electric, got into a horsepower race. Everybody wanted a 6,000 horsepower single-engine locomotive. EMD's answer was a brand new engine called the 265H, the H engine, and it went into a locomotive called the SD90MAC. There was just one problem. When EMD first put the SD90MAC in its catalog, the 265H engine wasn't actually ready. It was still failing tests. So EMD did something telling. It delivered the first batch of these locomotives with the older, proven 4,300 horsepower engine instead, promising to swap in the powerful new H engine later once the bugs were worked out. Those interim units were designated SD9043MAC. The bugs were never worked out. When the real 6,000 horsepower 265H units, the SD90MAC-H, finally entered service around 1998, they were plagued by trouble. The big engines suffered crankshaft failures and chronic overheating. Union Pacific and Canadian Pacific were the only two North American railroads that bought the H-engine version, and neither was rewarded for the gamble. The locomotives spent too much time broken down to justify their power. Here's the punchline that tells you everything. The downgraded units with the old engine, the SD9043MACs, massively outlasted their high-tech cousins. Railroads loved the reliable ones and ordered hundreds. The 265H units, meanwhile, were considered flops. The conversion that was supposed to upgrade the older units to 6,000 horsepower, it never happened, because nobody wanted the temperamental H engine. Union Pacific eventually returned its H engine fleet to EMD. Canadian Pacific's handful were retired and scrapped in the early 2010s. Virtually every 265H unit in North America was either scrapped or torn down and re-engined with the old, dependable design. Ironically, EMD's four-stroke engine did eventually get a second life years later to meet emissions rules, but the original SD90MAC-H remains a cautionary tale about shipping a locomotive before the engine is ready. Number 7. The British Rail Class 17 Clayton. Now we cross the Atlantic, because Britain produced some absolute legends of unreliability in its rush to dump steam. In the 1950s and 60s, British Railways launched a giant modernization plan to replace steam with diesel as fast as possible. In the frenzy, they ordered locomotives into full production before they'd been properly tested. The result was a parade of failures, and the Class 17, nicknamed the Clayton, is often called the worst of them all. The idea behind it was actually reasonable. Earlier small British diesels had a cab at one end, which meant terrible visibility when running the other direction. So the Class 17 put the cab in the middle, with low, sloped hoods at each end for the driver to see over. Good thinking. But to keep those hoods low, the engineers couldn't use one normal upright engine. Instead, they crammed in two small horizontal Paxman engines, one at each end, lying on their sides. And those engines were disastrous. They suffered camshaft failures and cracked crankcases. They leaked oil. Even after extensive modifications, fleet availability sat around a miserable 50 to 60%, meaning at any given time, half of them might be in the shop. For comparison, the simpler, proven Class 20 ran at around 90% availability, and that clever low-hood design, it backfired. The noses turned out to be so long that the crew couldn't actually see the track immediately in front of the locomotive, the very problem the whole design was meant to solve. British Railways built 117 of these things between 1962 and 1965. Some were reportedly put straight into storage from the factory. Withdrawals started in 1968, and many were scrapped after working lives of less than 5 years, an astonishingly short career for a mainline locomotive. BR gave up and simply ordered 100 more of the boring, reliable Class 20S instead. Out of all 117, exactly one survives in preservation. Number 6. The Krauss-Maffei ML4000. By the late 1950s, Southern Pacific had a theory. Traditional diesel-electric locomotives generate electricity to turn their wheels, and SP's engineers noticed that the constant high stress was wearing out the electrical gear. So they went looking for a completely different approach and stunned the American railroad industry by importing locomotives from Germany. The machine was the Krauss-Maffei ML4000, a diesel hydraulic. Instead of generators and traction motors, it used a fluid transmission like a giant automatic gearbox, driven by two high-revving Maybach V16 engines for a combined 3,540 horsepower. The first 3 units were shipped across the ocean and unloaded at the port of Houston in October 1961. Denver and Rio Grande Western ordered 3 of its own. Then reality set in. The trouble started in the mountains, exactly where these railroads needed the power most. Rio Grande discovered a nasty problem in its long tunnels. The locomotive's air intakes were mounted high up on the body, and when running through a tunnel, the trailing units happily sucked in the hot, filthy exhaust from the engine ahead. That superheated, polluted air caused accelerated engine wear and damage. The engines, it turned out, had been designed for German operating conditions, where locomotives spend only a small fraction of their time at full throttle. American mountain railroading demanded full power for long, punishing stretches, and in the heat, the imported engines couldn't take it. Rio Grande gave up on its trio in barely a year and sold them to Southern Pacific. SP, for its part, actually bought more, but found them unsatisfactory over the Sierra Nevada and banished them to flatter territory in California. They demanded a high level of maintenance and simply weren't rugged enough for the job. Interestingly, the hydraulic transmission itself proved reliable. The concept wasn't crazy, but by the mid-1960s, American builders could match that horsepower with sturdier, simpler machines, and the imports were retired by 1968. German crews and American rail fans had a blunt nickname for them that translates politely to the damned Krauts. One single unit survives today, lovingly preserved, and the tunnel exhaust problem they exposed actually inspired EMD's later tunnel motor designs. Number 5. The British Rail Class 28 Metrovic Cobo. Back to Britain, and to a locomotive so troublesome that even the company that built its engine seemed to want nothing to do with it. Between 1958 and 1959, Metropolitan Vickers built 20 of these Type 2 locomotives as part of that same modernization plan. They were odd-looking from every angle. They had a wheel arrangement found on no other British locomotive, 6 wheels on the bogie at one end and 4 at the other, giving them the nickname Cobo. And under the hood sat something unusual for a British locomotive, a 2-stroke engine, built by Crossley. The Crossley engine was a catastrophe almost from day one. These locomotives were meant to work in pairs on a prestigious overnight express freight running between London and Glasgow. Instead, the engines failed constantly. They belched out unacceptable levels of thick, smoky exhaust. They vibrated badly, and that vibration, combined with poor design, produced one of the most famous quirks in British railway history. The curved cab windows literally worked themselves loose and fell out while the locomotive was running down the line. By 1961, the situation was so bad that British Railways handed the entire class back to the manufacturer for major remedial work, both on the engines and to stop the windows from escaping. The windows were redesigned into flat glass facing forward, but the engines stayed unreliable. Crews often ran 2 together precisely because they expected one to break down, so the second could limp the train home. There's a story that when the press asked Crossley for comment as the locomotives were being sidelined, the company essentially replied that the engines were out of warranty and therefore British Railways' problem. Not exactly a ringing endorsement from the people who built them. The whole class was withdrawn by 1968, after only about a decade of service. Just one survives, a lone example now under restoration, a monument to a 2-stroke experiment that Britain would rather forget. Number 4. The Norfolk and Western John Henry. Now for one of the most extraordinary machines ever to turn a wheel, and one of the most impractical. Norfolk and Western was a coal railroad through and through. It hauled coal, it burned coal, and in the 1950s, when nearly every other railroad in America was racing to dieselize, NW desperately wanted to keep steam alive so it could keep burning the cheap fuel it carried by the trainload. So in 1954, Baldwin built the railroad a single gigantic experiment, a steam-turbine electric locomotive officially called the TE1, but known to everyone as the John Henry, after the folk hero who raced a steam drill. It was a beast. A coal-fired water tube boiler running at a ferocious 600 pounds of pressure spun a turbine, which drove generators, which powered electric motors on every single axle. It produced 4,500 horsepower and enormous pulling power. And it was long. The locomotive and tender together stretched over 160 feet, making it very likely the longest steam locomotive ever built. That length created an almost comic practical problem. The John Henry was so big it couldn't fit on the railroad's turntables. Think about that. You've built the most powerful, most advanced steam locomotive in your fleet, and you can't even turn it around normally. But the real killers were mechanical. This was at its heart a coal-burning machine full of delicate electrical equipment, a terrible combination. Coal dust worked its way into the electric traction motors and caused havoc. Water got in too. The semi-automatic boiler controls were troublesome and finicky. The turbine blades could be damaged when the locomotive backed hard onto a train, and it was hugely expensive to build for a one-off, complicated and hard to service. The crews and shop forces struggled with it, and although some of the early bugs were gradually tamed, it never made a real case against the diesel. Norfolk and Western, the last great holdout of American steam, finally admitted defeat, bought diesels and struck the John Henry from its roster in early 1958. It was cut up for scrap, a magnificent doomed monster that couldn't even find a turntable to call home. Number 3. The Chesapeake Ohio M1. If the John Henry was an impractical giant, the Chesapeake Ohio's M1 was an outright disaster, and arguably one of the most ill-conceived locomotives ever built. The story is almost identical in spirit. The C&O was another coal-hauling railroad that didn't want to give up on coal as diesels took over. Its ambitious president wanted a spectacular new luxury passenger streamliner called the Chessie, and he insisted it be pulled by coal-fired steam turbine locomotives to honor the railroad's coal roots. So in 1947 and 1948, Baldwin and Westinghouse delivered 3 enormous steam turbine electrics, numbered 500 to 502. They were the longest single-unit locomotives in the world at the time, over 150 feet long, weighing more than 850,000 pounds, with a 6,000 horsepower turbine. And in an act of almost breathtaking bad design, the turbine and generator compartment was inaccessible from the cab. To reach the machinery, crews had to go through a door at the front of the tender and crawl through a passage. Imagine trying to troubleshoot a failing turbine that way, in service. The M1s were unreliable from the start. Their performance posed absolutely no threat to the diesel. And then came the crowning insult. The Chessie, the glamorous train these locomotives were specifically built to haul, never actually entered service. Passenger traffic collapsed after the war. The project was cancelled, and the gleaming new passenger cars were repainted or sold off. So the C&O was left with 3 of the longest, most complicated, most unreliable locomotives ever built, and no train for them to pull. They puttered around in a bit of passenger service, earned the sarcastic nickname Sacred Cow, and then vanished. All 3 were retired and scrapped by 1950, just 2 to 3 years after they were built. For machines that cost a fortune, that is a staggeringly short and useless life. The C&O, Norfolk and Western and Baldwin poured enormous money into research on this steam turbine dream. Not one railroad made it work. The M1 is the purest example of a railroad's stubbornness against the future, costing it dearly. Number 2. The Baldwin Centipede. This one is legendary among railroaders for all the wrong reasons. A locomotive so awkward to maintain that its own construction method doomed it. The Centipede, officially the Baldwin DR-12-8-1500/2, was Baldwin's first serious attempt at a mainline road diesel. And it was unlike anything else. It rode on a nearly unbroken row of axles, a dozen of them, earning the nickname Centipede for its insect-like row of legs. 2 engines inside produced a combined 3,000 horsepower. 50 plus were built between 1945 and 1948 for the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Seaboard Airline, and the National Railways of Mexico. Here's the fatal flaw. Baldwin was a legendary steam locomotive builder, and it built these diesels the same way it built steam engines, one at a time, essentially by hand. That meant no 2 centipedes were exactly alike. The wiring, the placement of equipment, the internal details, they varied from unit to unit. For a shop mechanic, this was a nightmare. You couldn't learn one locomotive and apply it to the next, because the next one was wired differently. Even routine maintenance became a guessing game. On top of that inconsistency, the machines were simply unreliable. They leaked oil. They leaked coolant. They produced excessive smoke. And in the worst cases, they caught fire, sometimes doing several of those things at once. The Mexican units reportedly even arrived from the factory with parts missing. The Pennsylvania Railroad had grand plans, briefly assigning a pair to haul its famous Broadway limited passenger train. That didn't last. The high maintenance costs and poor reliability quickly got the Centipedes demoted. The PRR derated them and banished them to helper service, shoving other trains up grades, a far cry from their intended glory. And the cruelest fact of all, these machines were essentially obsolete the day they were built. EMD was already selling a vastly superior standardized product. By the early 1960s, most Centipedes had been scrapped. Not a single one was preserved. an unmistakable, unforgettable-looking locomotive, and a maintenance disaster that helped drive Baldwin out of the diesel market for good. Number 1. The Pennsylvania Railroad T1, and here it is, perhaps the most beautiful locomotive on this entire list, and one that crews came to dread for one maddening reason: the Pennsylvania Railroad T1. Just look at it. Styled by the famous industrial designer Raymond Loewy, the T1 was a sleek, shark-nosed streamliner, gorgeous and futuristic. Underneath it was a duplex, a 4-4-4-4 arrangement with two separate sets of driving wheels and cylinders in one rigid frame, an idea meant to reduce the pounding these fast engines inflicted on the track. It had enormous driving wheels and advanced poppet valves, and it was genuinely one of the fastest steam locomotives ever built, comfortably capable of exceeding 100 miles per hour. 2 prototypes appeared in 1942, and 50 production units followed in 1945 and 1946. So what went wrong? 2 words that every T1 crew came to fear: wheel slip. The T1 slipped its driving wheels violently, and not just when starting a heavy train, which is common enough. It slipped at high speed, which is terrifying. If the locomotive hit a wet spot or a bump in the rail at 80 miles an hour, the front set of drivers would break loose and spin, then catch, and then the rear set would break loose, then catch, setting up a horrible oscillating back and forth. The crew would have to chop the throttle and slow down to regain control. That constant slipping also damaged the machinery and made the sophisticated poppet valves fail all too often. Now here's the honest, nuanced part that a good railway historian will tell you. Some argue the T1's slippery reputation is partly unfair. The prototypes, handled by careful, experienced crews, behaved far better. The production units were run by ordinary crews transitioning from the older K4 locomotive, which had a gentle, forgiving throttle. The T1's throttle was far more immediate and responsive, and drivers used to the old way could provoke a slip without realizing it. Engineers also traced part of the problem to how the springs were balanced, and modifications did help, but it didn't matter. Before the railroad could fully solve the T1's problems, the diesel arrived and settled the argument. On the very day the first production T1 was delivered, the Pennsylvania's first pair of EMD passenger diesels also entered service, and those diesels ran with around 99% availability at lower cost. Against that, a temperamental, slip-prone, hand-nursed steam locomotive stood no chance. The T1s were swept aside and scrapped within just a few years. The tragedy is that many believe the T1 could have been a great locomotive with more time and better crew training. It was fast, powerful, and stunning to look at. But in service, in the real world, it frustrated the men who ran it. And that is exactly why today enthusiasts are building a brand new T1 from scratch, hoping to finally give this beautiful, hated machine the redemption it never got. Which of these do you think got the most unfair reputation, and which one truly deserved the hate? Let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed this, there are plenty more railroad stories where this came from. Thanks for watching.